in finance, you see all the cards, you see all the spreadsheet. And so I think for a big part of it is having those conversations, connecting those dots, and making sure that the organization is growing in different parts of the organization at the right times.
We're the Headcount People. Our podcast talks about all things headcount management, and our guests are the masters. If you're in charge of planning, managing, or reporting on headcount and headcount spend, we'll help you crack the code on this delicate dance by giving you strategies and tools from the masters themselves. Make sure to subscribe and follow for every new episode right when it drops. Here's your host, Tushar Makija.
Hello, everybody. This is Headcount People, episode 6. And today we are with my good friend, Dave Wieseneck from Demostack. Hi, Dave.
Hey,
What's
how's
the
it
weather
going,
in New York like?
It's honestly, it's getting nice and warm. It's still a little cold, but it's getting warmer every day, and spring is here. So I'm a happy man.
Spring is here. I think in today's episode, we're going to really focus on, is spring really here back for us startups? Is the financial situation back in spring? But before we get started about talking about spend management, headcount, and all the cool things that you've done in your life as a leader of finance for, I would say, largely startups, and now at Demostack, why don't we start with a quick introduction? Like, hello, I'm Dave.
Sure. So David Wieseneck, I've now worked at multiple startups. First, way long ago, PricewaterhouseCoopers as an auditor, then for a company called OLX, where I was the right hand for a CFO and kind of did everything finance and accounting related. Worked for a company called Let Go, which was a classified mobile marketplace. And now I work here at Demostack, and we're a B2B SaaS company that sells to sales and marketing departments as a demo replacement software. So been in this space for now over 10 years, working at various startups, and really working on everything accounting, finance, and legal related. And of course, a little bit of people ops as well. So fun stuff.
Fun stuff. I for the listeners, I would like to say is that Dave is one of our first guests on this podcast who actually is working in the Series A, Series B startup world, and has always worked and joined as one of the first or the earliest members of the finance team, and actually has built out the financial operations of a startup. And specifically at Demostack, you joined right before Series A and were instrumental in getting set the company up for their Series B as well.
I joined right after the Series A and helped raise the Series B. But I think to your point there, I've my kind of forte is really joining early and building a finance department from scratch, building accounting, finance, legal, all from scratch, putting in all the systems, building out the team, and helping the company scale. Of course, once it gets to a certain size, that's not really where I play. Great. Happy to kind of move on to the next thing, but that's really my space. Yeah, Series A.
Good. So you help the company set their foundation and get them on this path of growth, and then sometimes you can enjoy from the sidelines, right? The equity is only growing, so a smart move. I think this is also going to be very interesting, again, for the listeners, because I've known Dave at least from 4 years now, and I would say that I find Dave to be very opinionated, which is actually good as a finance leader, because you are driving a lot of good processes and good decisions at a company that is moving really, really fast, which may not be thinking about finance. So I think today's conversation is going to be really interesting for not just seasoned startups or startups post Series B, but for all the early stage startups who are actually now in this new environment of not being able to spend all the money in the world and have to go and build good processes and have to actually get involved in finance much sooner than later.
I think you hit it right on the mark. I really like to build in good financial hygiene into the business, good processes, good systems. It has a lasting impact. And because we do it early, it has an oversized impact, I'd say, on the business than kind of waiting and having to do a lot of cleanup later. So that's how I kind of view things.
Awesome. So because we are we are recording this episode in the month in which we had the SVB collapse, and also, the general macro mood seems to be of default no rather than default yes. How have you adjusted? What has changed for you and your CEO at Demostack?
Yeah, I think first of all, the last 2 weeks have been all hands on deck and a little bit of a whirlwind. Um, for us, first and foremost, I think we've been in a capital preservation mode for a while now. Obviously, with
Mhm.
interest rates being high and VC investment kind of being at an all time low, we've been in a capital preservation mode, but that didn't necessarily mean treasury. And I think treasury and the terminology and all the processes that go into it are very much coming back in vogue. I think we're taking a lot more precautions when it comes to banking and treasury, and having a keen eye on actual capital preservation, literally our deposits, not just our burn rate. So that's been kind of the talk of the town over the past 2 weeks. We're all setting up additional bank accounts and additional security protocols to make sure that there's no fraud and things like that all around our treasury function.
Can you unpack what capital preservation also means, and what are some of the decisions that in this new world you are not making or have completely punted this out multiple quarters out? So what are you spending money on and what are you not spending money on?
For sure. So I think in a big way we're cutting back on things that don't have a clear ROI or a specific need. For example, I think in the past we would have bought software with the expectation that we'll grow into it, or with the expectation that people will use it. I think now we're taking a really hard look at kind of all of our software needs, all of our consultant needs, and making sure there's clear line to value on certain things. I also think when it comes to software, you buy software, you deploy it, and you expect everybody to use it, even if it's not fully utilized. You're still getting some value from it. And what I tell my team is, it's not just the cost the cost on the purchase order, but also the time and effort that's going into it and the risk that's going into it. There is a cost to software that goes beyond the purchase order. And so I really push back on the team now to really think, do we need this software? Is it going to have a large ROI, and a clear ROI and a quick time to value? Because if it's going to take too long or we're not going to see it, I want to hold off on making that purchase until we have that clear need in the future.
That's very important. And I think this applies not just to other finance leaders listening in, but also other companies that may be selling to finance leaders. It's like, is there a framework that you can share on how you're evaluating ROI? And how should someone present ROI to a CFO making a purchase?
Yeah, I think part of the decision making is how quickly can we get up and running? What is kind of the total cost of ownership? Am I going to have to dedicate, someone's 40% of their job and their time to administering this product, or really is it much smaller kind of administration needs? Are we going to be able to quickly deploy it to all of the relevant stakeholders, or is it going to be a long deployment and only a few people are going to use it? Is it going to increase revenue quickly or decrease costs quickly, elsewhere? And how can we prove out that it's going to do the things it says, not just say, we think it's going to do this, we hope, but rather, can we prove it out that it's going to happen, and that it's going to happen quickly? I think that's usually the framework that I use. I don't think there's any one specific framework. It's really about asking questions, making sure there truly is a need, before making that dive in.
All right. So if I summarize this, it's not just about what the software can do in the long term, but what the software can do today. A direct line of sight into either increasing revenue or reducing costs. And then most importantly, this onboarding and the continuous administration, how easy or how difficult it's going to be, especially if it is going to take man hours off an already smaller team. I think that's uh, I think save money or increase revenue was the obvious way, but obvious thing to think about. But I think I really like how you mentioned that, hey, as sellers, and we should also start thinking about how quickly can we onboard you and what is the continuous support that the companies can provide. So that's really good insight. Thank you. I want to now start talking a little bit more about growth. There is still a plan. I'm assuming that the board has still suggested there is a certain growth that is expected out of a company. And in order to support that growth, you have to spend money. How has your approach at Demostack to, more generally spend management adjusted to this new normal where you have to grow, but you also have to preserve capital?
Yeah, I think the difference is last year or a year ago, kind of before interest rates started to increase, it was really kind of this terminology you've heard a lot, growth at all costs, right? And what that meant is, even before you're at the place where it makes sense, hiring well ahead of the need, putting in processes and systems with the expectation that you'll be at a certain place, let's say 6 months from now. I think the kind of now it's more about sustainable growth, which just means waiting until the moment where you have the capacity to hire an additional person or have the capacity to invest a little bit further, just not getting too far out in front of your skis, kind of waiting until you need to, and then taking that, that decision to hire or to spend the money on that additional investment. It's just really about being smart about your growth, making sure that it's profitable growth and that it's accretive growth, as opposed to kind of just expecting that you'll grow into it if you make that investment.
Okay, now let's pivot into the topic of the day and the topic of the podcast, which is headcount, right? And from an outside-in perspective, some folks may think, oh, I'm already small. I'm not, this year, headcount is no-brainer. I'm not going to increase headcount. Everything is shut, right? But I don't think that's good long-term thinking. So from your perspective, you are a growing company. How are you thinking about headcount at Demostack?
Yeah, I think for us, we think, headcount and the associated costs make up 80% of our P&L, right? 80% of our operating costs. So when planning and when talking about it and making strategic decisions, it's usually the top priority, right? So for us, we like to think about, where are we going? What are our needs today? And do we have the right team members in the right places to execute on our plan? Of course, thinking about the future, but in the past, we might have thought, what are our needs for the next 12 months and making sure we have a good plan to get there. Now we've brought that down a little bit shorter to say, like, what are our needs for the next 3 months, making sure we put, the right resources in the right places to execute on that. I don't think we're thinking as long-term as we were in the past.
That's great. But let me try to unpack this a little bit more, right? If we have to, it seems very obvious that, let's find the right people to join the team at the right time. But, the labor market is still fairly hot. Finding good talent is difficult, despite, we're hearing about all of these different layoffs. And the cost of hiring the right people, talented folk, or the most experienced folks is also high. So how do you go about planning or making those decisions, right? Walk us through a process that you did most recently with your exec team, what were the inputs? How did you do it? What tools did you use, if any? And then how did you come down to that decision-making process?
Yeah, well, it depends on what team we're talking about, right? I think it all starts with what are you trying to accomplish and what's your capacity? Right now, I think we're all trying to do more with the team we have, and see how we can increase capacity with the team we have and save costs there. But we want to take a look and say, look, what is the capacity of the team today? Where are you going to be in 3 months? And depending on the team, you're making a decision is, do we add more people to this? Do we add a different type of team member? Do we add a tool that will increase the capacity of the current team that we have? I think that's the conversations that we have. It just depends on what team you're looking for, right? So if it's the sales team, you're thinking about what is our funnel, what are our conversion rates, and then where in that funnel do we want to add people? It could be AEs, it could be SDRs, it could be a RevOps person to increase capacity and throughput. And then same thing for like CSMs or sales engineers, understanding kind of what your sales plan is, and then how many sales engineers or CSMs you're going to need to deliver on those customers in the months afterwards. And then for R&D, it's really about, what's our capacity to deliver on, whether it be, new features or servicing our current customers. And are they working on the right things at the moment? Should they be working on something slightly differently, new features versus fixing bugs and technical debt? And then what is their throughput, and do they have the right team to execute? I think so. You just want to have a conversation with your different team members and go deep on each department on what are the levers that you need to pull. And then people are a resource that you deploy against those levers. So sometimes you need more people, sometimes you don't, and it's just about resourcing or maneuvering people differently. I think that's how we tend to have those conversations. And if it is about hiring, it's understanding, are you hiring net new? Are you making a backfill for someone who's leaving or was terminated? And then kind of just planning that out into your financial model in a holistic way.
Okay. I think now you have the framework down, like, okay, ask these questions, do this, but how would you do it in a spreadsheet?
It's a dance, right? It's more of an art than it is a science. I think in the end of the day, you have to trust your other leaders in the organization that they know their teams better than you do in finance, right? So in finance, we can help ask the right questions. In finance, we can give perspective across teams, because the sales team might not know exactly what the CSM team is doing. Who's not going to know exactly what the R&D team is doing. We'll have exec meetings, right? But everybody's very focused on building their teams, delivering on their objectives, right? You might not have the perspective. In finance, you see all the cards, you see all the spreadsheet. And so I think for a big part of it is having those conversations, connecting those dots, giving a heads up that one team's going to need more capacity because you're seeing something over here in the plan, and making sure that the organization is growing in different parts of the organization at the right times, right? So of course, for a sales cycle, right, you're going to want to increase your BDR team to deliver on leads. And then maybe a month or two later, that's going to deliver more for the AEs. So you might need to increase your AEs month or two later, and then increase CSMs or sales engineering's team members soon after that, so they can handle the incoming load. So you need to make sure kind of to orchestrate it across the team. But you are in finance. It's not your job to know exactly how many people are needed and what the capacity is. It's your job to ask the right questions to the leaders, sense check, call BS when you need to, push back when you need to. And I think it's really, really about asking the right questions, being very curious, and understanding what all these people do and how they impact the business, and then trusting your VPs that they're making good decisions with the best interests of the company at heart.
That's great. And I've always heard you say, not just, in many of our conversations, that you consider yourself not just as a finance person, but as a true business partner. So you want to be in the other leaders' shoes in the organization to really understand what their challenges are and how you can be a supporter as well as enabler to get them and help them be successful. And what I really like, you said that all of this has to be well orchestrated, right? Because a product has to be designed. In order for design, you should write a good spec. So you need a product manager, then you need a designer, and then you need the engineer, and then you need BDRs, and then you need AEs, and then finally you need sales engineers, and then you need CSMs. So all of this flows in one way. I'm assuming, like all finance people, you are a spreadsheet wizard. So are we saying all of this is being tracked in a spreadsheet?
First of all, you should see my spreadsheet. Yes, it is all. My people model is all in a spreadsheet. We layer in. First, we start with who's on our team, what are their start dates, who's active, who's part-time, who's terminated, right? Where are we today? And then we layer in who have we made offers to, who's pending to be starting. We know that information. It's usually in our ATS, or we've made an offer, so we have a contract. So we layer in that information. They're starting soon. Their cost is going to come in. And then we layer in who is active in our ATS. Who are we looking to hire? What stage are they in, right? If they're going to, if they're in final interviews, we know they're going to start maybe in a month or two. If we just kicked off the rec, maybe it's going to be 3 or 4 months before we start that person. That has direct impact on cost, right? So you want to layer those people in and bring them into the model, at a staggered moment. And then there's kind of recs that aren't open yet, but we want to hire. And that's when you work with your team members. Hey, when do you think this role will start? What's the right cadence to bring this in? Is it 6 months from now or 12 months from now? And then kind of beyond 12 months is very finger in the air, right? We use benchmarks, we use ratios, how many AEs to BDRs, how many product to R&D. Use those benchmarks and you do more of a high level forecast beyond that. But yes, that's how everything right now is in Excel, with the months that are as close to today as possible. Those are, the upcoming months, those have a much higher fidelity versus 12 months or 24 months from now, which are a little bit more finger in the air, a little bit more aspirational, or higher level planning.
Right. So let's try to understand a little bit more about that spreadsheet process now. From your perspective, I think finance is always resourceful to connect and go find the right person to get the right data. But how do you think you're doing today, or how do you imagine you would do it, in the future, where this information is also pushed down to the line managers, the recruiters, and the people partners who are actually helping hire or retain the talent?
Yeah, I think that's one of the drawbacks of our current process is it's in Excel, right? It's living on my computer. We have good conversations with hiring managers, the recruiters, HR, kind of every 2 weeks to kind of update the model with the latest information. That's manual, right? Ideally, our process would be informed by the ATS automatically, informed by our HRIS automatically, informed by, let's say, the sub budgets of specific team members, so that people could raise their hand and say, hey, I don't need that role. I actually need this role now. And there's a difference to the budget. And then we would have more of a real-time, update. But right now it's very manual. And I think we're doing good enough with the resources that we have, especially at our size. But I think there's probably a lot of automation, a lot of systemization of this process that we can do. Just requires us to, invest in the time and the effort to deploy that and find the right tool to do it,
Right. And I think this will be really helpful from your perspective. What would be that transitional phase? Like where in your current process do you believe that you will hit a point where living inside a manual spreadsheet or an Excel sheet is not enough or not cutting. How do you think that transition would take place?
Yeah, I think the right time is usually when you have 2 or 3 hands in the pot. So if it's one person kind of updating this, it's quite easy to do, but it's a little bit messy, a little bit manual. Once you have 2 or 3 people in it, um, you'll have multiple versions of the same doc. You have issues where one person updated, but the other person didn't see those updates. And you start to say, we need one source of truth for this. So really when you have like 2, 3, especially 4 people, their hands in the process, giving different perspectives. So maybe like a recruiter, a head of people, and a head of finance. And then you want to start to bring in more department leaders. That's when you say, okay, we need to automate and systematize this. I think Team Ohana is doing that. And I think that's when you want to start to look for something like that. I would say the right moment is when you're growing, and this update is taking too much of your time, where you're not like thinking strategically. All you're doing is doing the updates. So usually that's when you're hiring like 4 to 5, definitely above that, people a month. I would say probably around like the 100 growing to 150, and definitely once you're at like 200, that's when you really want to start implementing a tool like this, because it starts to get unwieldy in Excel and definitely unwieldy in Google Sheets for sure.
I think you mentioned like 4 or 5 hiring. What about the the attrition management or the changes that is happening to the existing workforce, which is level changes, salary changes, employment changes? How do you account for those? And because I mean, that's if you're only going to hire, let's say, a 150-person company, and you are adding 50 new people, but the other 150 may go through some change, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's right. Yeah. So maybe it's not 4 or 5 hiring per month, but it's really about how many changes you have per month, right? Because if you're hiring 2 or 3 people, but you have 6 or 7 changes, right? A few attrition, some team members that got salary raises, tracking all of that in Excel, as opposed to, like a true system, a true database, is really hard, right? All of those changes, you start to have to account for those changes. Maybe those changes happen in the future and you have to account for those. Otherwise, your expense calculations are going to be off. And then tracking, how did we do budget versus actual is also really hard to do, because that adds another layer of complexity on top of it. So yeah, it's probably more about how many changes you have in your organization as opposed to just the growth of new headcount.
That's great. And I think now that you mentioned budgets and forecasts, I think a natural segue and the next question that I would like to understand on your process with is how important is this variance tracking? And what is the level of variance that you look to keep your model up to date in a way that is it 3% variance? Is it 5% variance? And how should people just generally think about budget variance, especially
Yeah,
around
so
headcount? So much
So
of,
the way we think
80%.
about budget variance is less, because we're an early stage company, right? And I think keeping to the budget is important, but it's not the most important thing. I think what's most important is, what is your future projection? And for us, variance analysis helps us to inform, is our model projecting out the future well? Right. So if we're off by more than 5%, we know there's something that we're not taking into account, which means the future is off. So it's less about how did we do and keeping a scorecard on ourselves. It's more about, is our forecast projecting reality? Because what's most important right now is our burn, right? How much cash do we have today? How long is that going to last us? When do we need to raise capital again? And if our forecast on our biggest P&L line item is off, then we have a big problem. We're going to be overshooting ourselves. We're not thinking about the future the right way. So really, the variance analysis helps us to inform our model to make it better and more accurate for the future. That's how we think about things right now.
That's awesome. And how do you report on these numbers? Like, how often are you running your variance analysis? Step one. Step two, once you have this information, how are you communicating or having discussion around variance with your CEO and then also with your board? Is there a template of information that you are giving into the leadership team as well as into the board?
So for where we are today, our perspective is not to overload the leadership team and the board with lots of spreadsheets of variance analysis, right? Our perspective is what are the key information that can help drive the business in as little information as possible. So right now, that's because we're very focused on sales and top line growth. It's very much around like, how are we doing from an ARR perspective? And then, how are we doing from a burn perspective? Not necessarily like a variance analysis against, one specific line item, but how are we doing from a burn perspective, and how long do we have, for our business? So we try to give information that's going to help drive the company. And then for the variance analysis, it's more for the finance team to help us inform our model and get better. And then, yes, if there are significant line items, we want to flag those, of course, to the leadership team or to the board. But for the most part, it's really about how are we doing from a revenue perspective and how are we doing from a burn perspective.
Is there what would be a good headcount report, or what would be good headcount metrics that you suggest companies should be tracking on a regular basis?
So what we like to look at is as simple as how much headcount do we have, in what departments, and then who have we added to the team, and what type of attrition do we have to the team? Is it regrettable, non-regrettable attrition? And then kind of just in what teams and where do they sit, just so we understand kind of where our teams are deployed and who we're investing as a company. We look at cost, of course. We looked at, average cost for different headcount. But those are kind of secondary to some of the higher level stuff.
Okay. So Dave, now let's talk about how should finance leaders work with the other departments in the company, especially the people department and the talent department, because they interface with the hiring managers, they interface with the employees much more than you are directly interfacing. So for all the HR leaders and the talent leaders listening on this podcast today, what are some of the ways that you think make working relationships better between finance, talent, and HR?
Yeah. So, what I always try to do is I try to make a really great relationship with our HR team. So connect at the hip pretty much. I want to be in sync with what they're working on. What are the impactful decisions that they're making that are going to impact the finances? So hiring, firing, merit cycles, performance cycles, things like that. I want to be informed of that, like at the beginning. I don't want to be surprised on the back end that we are, promoting 3 people that I haven't accounted for in the forecast. So it's all about communication, being on the same page, making sure that you're working with your HR leaders to plan for changes and understand the budgetary impact of that before moving forward with any decisions. And I think it just comes from a level of trust, really good communication, and making sure that you're working together. Very important. Of course, if you can build systems and processes that kind of enforce that, that's even better. But I think just starting off with a good culture and good communication is the kind of the first place to start. And then you can layer in process and systems to really enforce that and drive it into the organization for the long term.
Right. Now I'm going to ask you a philosophical question, right? We're recording this in March, end of March 2023. What is your outlook for the rest of the year? How are you informing your outlook? And what would be the final parting thoughts that you would leave all the listeners with, who, the audience is largely startups. And if this is the early stage startup audience that we are talking to, how should they be thinking about growth, about spend, and anything else that is top of mind for you?
Yeah, I think so. My outlook is, at the beginning, at the top of this call, we talked about it being spring outside, but it's not quite spring for growth stage tech companies. It's still winter out there. We look at the interest rate coming from the Fed. They just raised interest rates again, 25 basis points. Nobody knows if this is the end of that, and they'll kind of taper off, or if they're going to keep raising rates. So it's still winter, and it's going to take some time for the market to rebound. And so I would expect and plan that the fundraising market is still going to be flat. We're not all going to be getting additional capital into our companies. So plan for that. Make sure that you don't get ahead of your skis, whether it be hiring or spending decisions, that you plan for lower growth than what you expect. And when you start seeing higher than expected growth, then of course, go out there, hire additional people, make additional spending decisions. But I would say plan for that downside case. Take a look at your risks. Make sure you protect against your risks. Take a look at the opportunities you have. Go ahead and capitalize on those opportunities. Just don't get ahead of your skis.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Dave, for all the wisdom. And we really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.